As soon as I stepped off the dusty gravel road and onto the familiar path leading to Robert's secluded cabin, a flood of memories washed over me. Robert and I had been friends for years, connected by a friendship that started in the most unlikely of places, a coffee shop where we'd both been seeking refuge from a chaotic day. He was 60 now, wise with life experience and filled with a quiet kind of charm, his laughter as genuine as his warmth. I often wondered how our paths had crossed, so different as we were. But here we were, him inviting me to his cabin for a few days of peace and quiet, away from the city's relentless noise. The cabin came into view as I rounded the final bend, and there he was, standing on the porch, arms crossed, a welcoming smile already forming on his face. It was a smile I'd come to cherish open, yet with a hint of something hidden beneath the surface, a quality about Robert that intrigued me. He waved, calling out, "You made it, Clara? Thought you might have changed your mind about roughing it out here." I laughed, shaking my head as I approached. Not a chance. I needed this break as much as you did. Stepping onto the porch, I felt an odd sense of ease and anticipation. The crisp mountain air was a welcome change from the city, and the dense forest surrounding us created a cozy cocoon that seemed to erase all distractions. Robert's cabin was quaint yet rustic, exuding an old-world charm, with exposed wooden beams and a porch overlooking a sprawling lake. The whole scene felt surreal, like stepping into a different era. "Come on in," he said, holding the door open for me. Inside, the cabin was warm, the faint scent of cedar mingling with the soft crackle of the fireplace. I set down my bag, and as I looked around, taking in the wood-paneled walls and well-worn leather furniture, Robert watched me with a soft expression I couldn't quite read. "It's been a while since I've had company up here," he said, almost to himself. "I think I forgot how good it feels to share this place." I gave him a smile. "It's beautiful, Robert." Really, our eyes met for a brief moment, and I felt a flicker of something familiar, yet new pass between us. We spent the evening talking about everything and nothing, as we always did. Robert was an exceptional listener, and his thoughtful, calm demeanor had always been a comforting contrast to my more animated personality. It was the kind of dynamic I treasured, grounding and serene, yet stimulating in its own way. As the night wore on, we shared stories of our younger years, tales I hadn't heard from him before. At times, our laughter would echo through the cabin, breaking the comfortable silence and bringing a warm glow to the dimly lit room. After a while, the fire began to die down, casting long shadows across the cabin's walls. I reached for the bottle of wine we'd brought, pouring the last of it into our glasses. Robert's gaze lingered on me, and there was a softness in his eyes, an expression I'd only glimpsed a few times before. "Thank you for coming out here, Clara. Really," he murmured, his voice low, yet full of something unspoken. "Of course, Robert," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. I was suddenly aware of the space between us, how small it had become over the course of the evening. Our hands brushed as I handed him his glass, and the brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through me. He looked at our hands, then back at me, his expression growing contemplative. "I know it's silly," he said, his gaze still on our intertwined fingers, "but it's nice to know someone's here with me. I didn't realize how much I missed it." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle over us. "You deserve to have someone here, Robert. You're one of the kindest, most genuine people I know." For a moment, silence filled the space between us. The room felt charged, as if we'd crossed an invisible line, and neither of us dared to break the moment. The tension was subtle, yet undeniable, like an unsaid promise waiting in the wings. He moved closer, his eyes flicking to my lips and then back up to meet my gaze, a question lingering in his expression. I felt a thrill of nervousness, my pulse quickening as he leaned in, just close enough that I could feel his breath against my skin. But then he stopped, pulling back slightly, his hand dropping to his side. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "It's okay," I replied softly, though my heart ached with a strange mix of relief and disappointment. The vulnerability in his eyes tugged at me, and I found myself reaching out, placing my hand on his arm, as if to reassure him, to bridge the distance he had just created. He looked down at my hand on his arm, his expression softening. "Maybe. Maybe we should call it a night," he suggested, though the words sounded hesitant, almost reluctant. "Maybe," I agreed, my voice catching, yet neither of us moved. Finally, I withdrew my hand, feeling the coolness of the cabin settle over me as I bid him good night. I retreated to the small guest room he had prepared, lying awake in the quiet darkness, the night's subtle tension replaying in my mind. The unspoken emotions, the almost kiss, they lingered, leaving me restless and longing for something I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge before. The following morning, Robert was already up, sipping coffee on the porch when I joined him. He greeted me with a warm smile, and though neither of us mentioned the night before, I felt the lingering effect of it in every glance, every smile, every small interaction. The morning passed quietly, but the tension from last night remained, simmering just below the surface, unspoken yet palpable. As the day wore on, we decided to take the canoe out onto the lake. The sun was high, casting a warm glow over the water, and the quietness of the lake provided a perfect escape from the weight of the unspoken. As we paddled, our conversation flowed naturally, easing the tension bit by bit, though I still felt his gaze on me more than once. At one point, I looked up, catching him watching me with an intensity that made my breath hitch. He didn't look away, holding my gaze as if daring me to look deeper, to see beyond the friend I'd always known. My heart pounded, a mix of fear and thrill washing over me as I allowed myself to meet his gaze, unflinching. Neither of us said a word, but in that moment, everything was said. The air between us was charged, and I knew that whatever was happening between us, it was far more powerful than I had anticipated. "Clara," he murmured, breaking the silence. His voice was softer, more vulnerable than I'd ever heard it, and something in the way he said my name made me shiver. The rest of the day passed in a blur of shared moments, each one more intimate than the last, yet still restrained. By the time the sun began to set, we found ourselves back on the porch, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. The quiet comfort of his presence wrapped around me, but the unresolved tension from last night weighed on me, pressing down like a physical force. At last, Robert broke the silence. "I think we should talk about last night," he said quietly, his eyes searching mine. "Maybe we should," I replied, my voice barely audible. He hesitated, his gaze intense, and I knew he was wrestling with something, a conflict that mirrored my own. But instead of speaking, he reached out, his hand gently resting on mine. The simple touch felt electric, a connection both familiar and new, and in that moment, I knew this was a line we both wanted to cross, but neither of us dared. He didn't say anything, just held my hand, his thumb brushing over my skin in slow, soothing circles that only added to the electric pull between us. The silence stretched on, both of us suspended in that fragile moment. I could feel the tension growing, each passing second amplifying the unspoken desire that hung between us, binding us closer together. Every small, shared glance, every gentle touch had built up to this moment, and now, standing on the edge of something we couldn't name, neither of us could look away. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and filled with a quiet urgency. "Clara, I don't know if this is something we should ignore anymore. It's been building between us, hasn't it?" His words were barely more than a whisper, but they held a weight that hit me hard, each syllable resonating with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. I nodded, feeling a blush rise in my cheeks, both embarrassed and emboldened by his honesty. "Yes, I think it has," I admitted, my voice trembling slightly. "But it's also terrifying, isn't it? This, whatever it is, it could change everything." He squeezed my hand gently, his gaze softening as he searched my face. "I know. I don't want to lose you, Clara. But sometimes you meet someone who changes you, who makes you feel something. More. And I don't know how to ignore that." The vulnerability in his eyes mirrored the uncertainty I felt. It would have been so easy to turn away, to dismiss this as a fleeting impulse, a spark born out of our shared solitude. But as I looked at him, at the man I'd come to care for deeply, I knew that what I felt was real. This wasn't just loneliness or the comfort of familiar companionship. It was something far more complex, a connection that went beyond friendship into territory that neither of us had expected. "Robert." "This is complicated," I murmured, feeling the intensity of his gaze lock onto mine. "But I think we owe it to ourselves to at least be honest about what's happening here. I felt it too, and maybe that's why I didn't want to come up here at first." He tilted his head slightly, his brows knitting together in a faint smile. "You almost didn't come." I laughed softly, a little embarrassed. I wasn't sure if I could handle it, whatever it was. I think part of me knew that being alone with you here would bring this. this feeling to the surface. Robert's expression grew serious again as he took in my words. "So what do we do about it?" he asked, his voice soft, his tone tinged with uncertainty. "I don't know," I replied honestly. "All I know is that I care about you, Robert, more than I expected, more than I probably should." He seemed to contemplate my words, his gaze fixed on mine with a new intensity, as if he were memorizing every detail of my face. And then, without another word, he leaned closer, closing the space between us. His hand reached up, resting gently on my cheek, his thumb brushing across my skin in a touch that was as tender as it was deliberate. My heart raced, caught between exhilaration and hesitation, but I couldn't bring myself to pull away. His lips hovered near mine, close enough that I could feel his breath, warm and unsteady. "Tell me to stop if this is too much," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the soft sounds of the forest around us. But I couldn't. I couldn't bring myself to say the words, even though I knew the weight of what was about to happen. Instead, I found myself closing the small distance between us, letting my lips press gently against his, a tentative touch that quickly deepened as we both gave in to the pull that had been building for so long. The kiss was soft at first, almost hesitant, like an unspoken promise that we were both afraid to break. But then, as if a dam had burst, the restraint between us dissolved, and the kiss grew more intense, more desperate. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt my arms wrap around his neck, holding on to him as if he were my anchor. Time seemed to lose all meaning as we stood there, wrapped up in each other, the rest of the world fading away. I could feel his heartbeat against mine, the warmth of his body pressing into me, grounding me in this moment. It felt both exhilarating and terrifying, as if I were standing on the edge of a precipice, about to leap into the unknown. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathless, our foreheads resting against each other as we tried to catch our breath. His hand remained on my cheek, his thumb tracing gentle patterns on my skin, and I felt an overwhelming surge of affection for him, a longing that was as raw as it was unexpected. "Clara," he murmured, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I don't know what this means or where it will lead, but I know I don't want to let you go." A lump formed in my throat at his words, and I felt my heart ache with a mix of joy and fear. "I don't want to lose this either," I whispered, my voice barely steady. "But it scares me, Robert. What if we're just lonely?" He shook his head slowly, his gaze steady as he looked at me. "This isn't just loneliness, Clara. You know that as well as I do." His hand dropped to intertwine with mine, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "I've spent enough years alone to know what loneliness feels like. This is different." I nodded, my heart pounding as I processed his words. He was right. This wasn't just a fleeting feeling or the result of isolation. It was something deeper, something that had been simmering between us for months, if not years. And now that we had finally allowed it to surface, there was no denying its intensity. We sat there in silence, our hands still joined, the weight of what had happened settling over us. The sky above had darkened, stars beginning to appear in the clear night sky, casting a soft glow over the lake. The air around us was cool, but I felt a warmth in Robert's presence that went beyond the physical, a comfort that only deepened the connection we had just uncovered. Eventually, he broke the silence. "Stay with me tonight, Clara," he said softly, his voice a gentle invitation. I looked at him, searching his face, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Part of me wanted to say yes, to give in to the longing that had been building between us. But another part of me hesitated, caught between desire and the fear of crossing a line we couldn't uncross. "Are you sure?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Yes, I don't know what this means, but I know I want to be with you. Even if it's just for tonight." The honesty in his words washed over me, melting away my doubts. I took a deep breath, my hand still entwined with his, and nodded. "Then let's not overthink it," I said softly, a slight smile tugging at my lips. He returned my smile, a look of relief mingling with the anticipation in his eyes. Gently, he led me back into the cabin, our hands still linked, as if letting go would break the spell that had been cast over us. Inside, the fire had burned down to embers, casting a warm, dim light across the room. Robert paused, turning to face me, his hands moving to my shoulders as he looked into my eyes, his expression soft and vulnerable. "This is real, Clara," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Whatever happens after this, tonight let's just be here. No expectations, no promises, just us." I nodded, my heart swelling with affection for him. Slowly he leaned in, his lips capturing mine once more in a kiss that was filled with all the tenderness and yearning that words couldn't express. It was a kiss that held the weight of our years together, the depth of the friendship we'd built, and the longing that had grown quietly between us. As the night unfolded, we let ourselves give in to the connection that had been building between us, each moment deepening the bond we shared. There were no more words, just soft touches and lingering glances, each one pulling us closer to a place we'd never thought we'd reach. In the quiet of the cabin, with only the soft crackle of the dying fire as our witness, we crossed a line we could never undo, a line that bound us together in a way that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. The night passed in a blur of emotions and sensations, each moment weaving us tighter together, as though we'd been building up to this for years. We moved in sync, letting our guards down entirely, sharing a closeness that left us both feeling raw and exposed. I could feel Robert's warmth surrounding me, his presence so familiar yet suddenly new, layered with emotions we'd never dared express before. Each gentle touch, every whispered breath felt like an unspoken confession, carrying the weight of years we had spent as friends, now transformed into something so deeply intimate. As dawn's light crept through the cabin's small windows, casting a soft glow over the room, I lay awake, my head resting on Robert's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. I felt a profound sense of peace, yet mingled with an undeniable undercurrent of uncertainty. What had we just done? How would this change us? He stirred, his arm tightening around me as his eyes slowly opened, meeting mine. For a moment, neither of us spoke, both of us suspended in the fragile intimacy of the morning light. A gentle smile spread across his face, his hand coming up to brush a stray lock of hair from my forehead. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep but warm, steady. "Good morning," I replied, unable to keep the smile from my own lips. Despite everything, the questions, the doubts, I felt a warmth in his presence, an assurance that seemed to anchor me in this uncertain reality. For a while, we simply lay there, wrapped in each other's arms, savoring the quiet closeness that felt both strange and perfectly natural. But as the moments stretched on, I felt the weight of our situation pressing down on me. I took a deep breath, lifting my gaze to meet his. "Robert, what does this mean for us?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me, his expression softening, but I could see the shadow of uncertainty in his eyes. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice quiet yet steady. "I didn't plan for this, but I don't regret it, Clara. Not a single moment." I felt a lump rise in my throat, a mixture of relief and fear flooding me as I processed his words. I don't regret it either. But where do we go from here? Do we just pretend this never happened? His hand came up to cup my cheek, his thumb gently brushing over my skin. "I don't think we can pretend, even if we wanted to. There's no going back to the way things were before. I think we both knew that, even before you came up here." I nodded, a bittersweet feeling washing over me. He was right. Our friendship had been shifting, evolving in subtle ways that neither of us had acknowledged until now. I realized that this wasn't just about one night. It was about years of shared moments, countless conversations, and a bond that had quietly deepened over time. "But what if we end up hurting each other?" I whispered, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at me since last night. "What if this ruins everything?" Robert took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving mine. "I don't have all the answers, Clara, but I know that you mean too much to me to let fear decide this for us. We don't have to have everything figured out right now. We can take things one step at a time, see where this leads, if that's something you want too." I felt a strange sense of comfort in his words, in his willingness to face the unknown with me, even if it meant venturing into unfamiliar territory. I nodded, a small, tentative smile breaking through the lingering uncertainty. "Then, let's try," I murmured. "Let's take it slow, figure this out together." His relief was evident in the soft smile that spread across his face. He leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to my forehead, and I felt a warmth bloom in my chest, the comfort of his presence grounding me once more. The rest of the morning passed in a quiet intimacy, a fragile understanding hanging between us as we went about our routine. We made breakfast together, our movements relaxed yet infused with a subtle awareness of each other. Every brush of his hand, every shared glance felt loaded with a newfound tenderness, a quiet promise of the path we had chosen to walk together. As we ate, the conversation flowed naturally, drifting from one topic to the next, just like it always had. But there was an added depth to our words now, an unspoken acknowledgement of the shift that had taken place between us. We spoke about everything and nothing, letting the familiarity of our friendship ease the edges of our new reality. When breakfast was over, we decided to take a walk by the lake. The air was crisp, the morning sun casting a golden hue over the water as we strolled along the shoreline, our footsteps in sync, our shoulders brushing occasionally in a way that felt both innocent and intimate. At one point, Robert stopped, his gaze fixed on the water. "Clara, do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd met sooner, if things had been different?" His question caught me off guard, but I could see the genuine curiosity in his eyes, the quiet yearning for answers we both knew didn't exist. I took a deep breath, considering his words. Sometimes, I admitted, my voice barely more than a whisper. I think about how things might have been if we'd met at a different time. But I also think, maybe this is exactly when we were meant to find each other. He nodded, a thoughtful look crossing his face. "I think you're right. Life has a funny way of bringing people together when they least expect it." A comfortable silence settled over us as we continued our walk, each of us lost in our thoughts, yet acutely aware of the other's presence. I felt a quiet contentment in the simplicity of it all, a peacefulness that seemed to wash away the lingering doubts. Later, as we made our way back to the cabin, Robert reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine in a way that felt both natural and thrilling. The simple touch sent a spark of warmth through me, a reminder of the connection we'd discovered and the journey we had tentatively begun. That evening, we found ourselves back on the porch, watching the sun set over the lake. The sky was painted in shades of pink and orange, casting a warm glow over the water, and the gentle sounds of the forest provided a soothing backdrop to the quiet peace that had settled over us. Robert broke the silence, his voice soft as he spoke. "I never thought I'd feel this way again, Clara. I thought those parts of me were behind me." I looked at him, a gentle smile tugging at my lips. "I know what you mean. I didn't expect this either. But maybe that's what makes it feel so real." He nodded, his gaze distant as he took in my words. "I think sometimes life surprises us with exactly what we need, even if it doesn't look the way we expected." The rest of the night passed in quiet conversation, our words filled with a shared understanding and a growing sense of acceptance. We didn't need to define what was happening between us or make promises we couldn't keep. We simply allowed ourselves to be, to exist in each other's presence without the pressure of expectations. As the fire died down and the room was cast in shadows, I felt the weight of our connection settle over us once more. Robert reached for my hand, pulling me close, his arms wrapping around me in a gentle embrace. We sat in silence, the warmth of his body grounding me, his steady breathing lulling me into a sense of calm I hadn't felt in years. Eventually, we found our way back to the bedroom, and as we lay tangled together in the quiet darkness, I felt a contentment that was both exhilarating and terrifying. The connection we'd uncovered was fragile, but it was real, and I knew that whatever happened next, we would face it together. The night was filled with soft whispers and tender touches, a slow dance of emotions and unspoken promises, and as I drifted off to sleep, wrapped in his embrace, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a quiet assurance that no matter what the future held, I was exactly where I was meant to be. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, bathing the room in a soft, golden glow. I lay there listening to the rhythmic sound of Robert's breathing beside me, his arm draped over my waist, holding me close as if he, too, was reluctant to let the moment slip away. I knew we couldn't stay like this forever. Reality was waiting for us beyond these cabin walls, but for now, I let myself savor the warmth and safety of his embrace. Eventually, he stirred, his eyes fluttering open, and when his gaze met mine, a soft smile spread across his face. He leaned over, pressing a gentle kiss to my forehead, his hand brushing my hair back with a tenderness that sent a shiver through me. "Morning," he murmured, his voice still thick with sleep. "Morning," I replied, my heart fluttering in response to the warmth in his eyes. There was something comforting in the simplicity of it, and waking up beside him, sharing this quiet intimacy that felt as fragile as it was powerful. We lay in silence for a while, neither of us wanting to break the spell. But as the minutes ticked by, I felt the weight of unspoken questions settling over us. What would happen next? Would we return to our lives pretending this was just a fleeting moment, a passing spark? Or was this the beginning of something deeper, something neither of us had anticipated? He must have sensed my unease because he tightened his hold around me, his gaze serious. Clara, I know this is complicated. I don't have all the answers, but I don't want you to think this was just a moment for me. I meant what I said. I don't want to let you go. His words settled over me, soothing the doubts that had begun to creep in. I reached up, my fingers brushing against his cheek. I don't want to let you go either, Robert, but this is all so new, and it's a lot to take in. He nodded, his gaze never leaving mine. Then let's take it one day at a time. We don't need to have everything figured out. Let's just see where this leads together. I felt a surge of relief, a quiet joy blooming within me at the simple honesty of his words. It wasn't a promise, but it was enough a shared commitment to explore whatever lay ahead, to take this journey hand in hand, one step at a time. We spent the rest of the morning in quiet companionship, moving through the cabin with an ease that belied the complexity of what had happened between us. Every touch, every shared glance felt loaded with a newfound tenderness, a silent acknowledgement of the shift that had taken place. After breakfast, we decided to take a hike up the mountain trail that led to a lookout point overlooking the lake. The air was cool and fresh, filled with the scent of pine and wildflowers, and as we made our way through the dense forest, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The steady rhythm of our footsteps, the sound of birds chirping overhead, and the quiet companionship we shared felt grounding, a reminder of the simple joys that had drawn us together in the first place. At the top of the trail, we stopped to catch our breath, taking in the breathtaking view. The lake stretched out before us, glistening in the sunlight, surrounded by towering trees and distant mountains. It felt like we were on the edge of the world, suspended in a moment that was both timeless and fleeting. Robert slipped his arm around my shoulders, pulling me close as we stood there, taking in the beauty around us. "Thank you for coming here with me, Clara," he murmured, his voice filled with quiet emotion. "I can't imagine sharing this with anyone else." I leaned into him, my heart swelling with affection. "I'm glad I came, Robert. I didn't realize how much I needed this, or how much I needed you." He pressed a gentle kiss to the top of my head, and we stood there in silence, letting the peace of the moment wash over us. It was a quiet, unspoken promise, a shared understanding that, whatever lay ahead, we would face it together. As we made our way back down the trail, I felt a quiet contentment settle over me. It wasn't just about what had happened between us, it was about the connection we had always shared, the friendship that had grown into something deeper and more meaningful. It felt like we were stepping into a new chapter, one filled with uncertainty but also with possibility. Back at the cabin, we packed up our things, preparing to return to our lives. The weight of the impending separation hung between us, casting a shadow over the afternoon, but we didn't dwell on it. Instead, we focused on savoring the last moments of our time together, finding comfort in each other's presence. When it was time to leave, we stood on the porch, our bags at our feet, both of us reluctant to break the fragile silence. Robert reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine, and I felt a pang of longing that I couldn't ignore. "I'll miss this," he said softly, his gaze meeting mine. "But this doesn't have to be the end, Clara. We'll find a way to make this work, one step at a time." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I believe you, Robert, and I'm willing to try. For us." He smiled, a warmth in his eyes that gave me the strength to let go of the doubts and fears that lingered. As we shared one final embrace, I felt a quiet assurance that, no matter what the future held, we would face it together. The drive back was filled with a bittersweet mixture of emotions: joy, longing, and a quiet hope that we could build something lasting from the fragile connection we had uncovered. And as I returned to my life, I carried with me the warmth of his embrace, the memory of his laughter, and the knowledge that, whatever happened, we had shared something real, something that had changed us both. In the days that followed, we stayed in touch, our conversations filled with the familiar ease of our friendship, yet laced with a newfound intimacy that made each exchange feel like a cherished secret. We took things slowly, as we had promised, allowing our connection to deepen naturally, without the pressure of labels or expectations. Our lives were still separate, but we found ways to bridge the distance, carving out moments of closeness in the quiet spaces of our everyday routines. A late-night phone call, a surprise visit, a shared meal, each small gesture became a reminder of the bond we had forged, a testament to the love that had blossomed between us. As time went on, we found a rhythm, a quiet understanding that allowed us to navigate the complexities of our relationship with grace and patience. There were moments of doubt, times when the uncertainty of our situation weighed heavily on us, but we always returned to each other, finding comfort in the quiet strength of our connection. And through it all, I discovered a newfound sense of peace, a quiet joy that had been missing from my life for so long. In Robert, I had found not only a partner but a friend, a confidant, someone who understood me in a way that went beyond words. In the end, it didn't matter that our love had come later in life, or that it had unfolded in a way neither of us had expected. What mattered was that we had found each other, that we had taken a chance on something real, something that brought us both a sense of belonging we hadn't known was possible. And as we continued our journey together, one day at a time, I knew that, whatever the future held, we would face it side by side, our hearts forever bound by the quiet, enduring love that had grown between us.